How's it going, everybody? This is going to be the opposing view lesson. We're going to review ethos, logos, pathos, and the pieces of a code sandwich, and then we're going to read the opposing view for the eSports paper that is the theme of these recorded lessons. So let's start with ethos, logos, pathos. So to review, ethos is credibility. Think about resume. If you're applying for a job, anything that would go on a resume would count as ethos. Think about qualifications. Think about experts. Who is the expert for whatever your topic is? That would be counted as ethos. Logos is logic. So again, remember that ice and ice water logical example that Jon Stewart made on the Daily Show, where he shows what displacement is with the ice in the water, and that doesn't make it overflow. But then he shows the separate ice that's on the land, and if that ice melts, then it goes into the water. And that's a great example of a logical argument that just shows what climate change or the negative effects of climate change are really clearly. Statistics. This can also include graphs and charts. And finally, anytime there's data or science mentioned, it's going to be logos. Pathos is emotion. Remember, pretty much everything you did in your essay 1 counts as emotion. For our purposes, it also includes stories, or also known as anecdotes, which are the same thing. Remember that for your essay number 2, we need at least one example of each type of argument, ethos, logos, pathos. So you want to be making sure you're thinking of who the expert is for whoever your topic is. Some data, statistics, graphs, and charts, and then a story. Remember that you are allowed personal pathos, not too much, like 3 or 4 sentences. Excuse me. But just remember that personal pathos does not satisfy the pathos requirement. We need at least one example of pathos from the internet. Let's talk about code sandwich. So 5 pieces of code sandwich. First piece is the claim. This is the argument that you are making. For the purposes of this paper and for essay 2, there's always going to be only 2 choices for this particular paper. When we get to essay 3, you'll have way more freedom about how to argue things and what to do. But for this one, we have 2 clear sides. In the example of the paper we're reading here is eSports is a sport. That's the thesis. And then not a sport is the opposing view. Okay, cool. So number 2. Introduction of the author with ethos. Introduce the author with ethos. So just remember, each time we meet a new author in your paper, we want some ethos about them. Remember, if a source does not have an author, which happens sometimes, not a lot, but it does happen, then we want ethos about the source. So if you have a New York Times article, we want to have the title of that article and some ethos about the New York Times. Please do remember that we never want to just cite the source. We always want to make sure that we include the title, because there's always a title. And then if there's an author, include the author. But again, never just the source, please. Number 3 is evidence. You have a few choices here with paraphrase, which means that you're putting the quote partially or completely in your own words, or a direct quote that goes in quotations from the source. Remember that you are allowed a block quote. A block quote is a quote that's 4 lines or more. We talked about block quote formatting in the thesis in the introduction lesson. Just remember, you're only allowed 1. If you have multiples, you will lose some points. And again, for evidence, you have choices: ethos, logos, and pathos. And to repeat again, you need at least one argument of each type, please. And again, you can have way more. Your paper can be stacked one way or the other, but we definitely need at least one example of each, please. Next piece is commentary. This is where you discuss the claim and evidence in your own words. So discuss claim, evidence in your own words. It's also an opportunity to transition into your next idea, or to stack evidence for the same claim. Evidence for the same claim. Final piece Is citation. Again, if you're introducing the author with ethos, that counts as citation. You don't have to cite again at the end of that sentence. However, moving forward from that sentence, we want to make sure that you're citing each sentence. So you need to weave your citation throughout. Remember that I do allow a single moment of personal knowledge, a fact or a detail, a couple of sentences. Everything else needs clear citation. So you need to be heading to Google and finding sources that support your summary or arguments, whatever you're doing. Okay, we are going to take a look at the opposing view of this eSports paper. And if the thesis is that eSports should be considered a sport, the opposing view here is that it should not be considered a sport, and some arguments about why. Okay, let's read this together. So the first thing I want you to notice is a little bit of disorganization on the part of this writer. We start with a good opposing view claim. It says an oppositionist would say that there's not enough physical activity for video games to be considered a sport, but at least there are some, and there are physical consequences if a person played too long. So they have a counter here that there at least are some, and that's, I think, is good. When you have your opposing view, a counter can be a very positive piece. But just remember that we want to start with the opposing view first and then have the counter, rather than start with the counter and then have the opposing view. So your structure is going to be arguing for your thesis, at least 2 pages for your thesis, get to the opposing view, give us a page, 3/4 of a page opposing view, and then if you have a counter, include that counter at the end rather than jumping right into the counter at the beginning. Okay, so let's read this. An oppositionalist would say that there's not enough physical activity for video games to be considered a sport. That's the opposing view claim, not enough physical activity. And then we get the counter right away here. But at least there are some, and there are physical consequences if a person played for too long. In USA Today, which is an international American newspaper, so again, we're getting some ethos about USA Today. And again, that means that this person's source did not have an author. There is proof of some injuries that can be introduced from playing video games. The columnist Jennifer Jolly, an Emmy Award-winning consumer tech contributor, host of USA's Digital News. This is excellent ethos. Do notice that this person has put the ethos in quotes. You don't need to do that. You can just straight out say the ethos, but this is good ethos about Jennifer. Due to the extreme length of time that people play video games for, there's a possibility that the lungs can collapse and that you can be diagnosed with carpal tunnel, tennis elbow, severe shoulder, back, neck, and foot pain. So we're getting good evidence for this counter A, that there are physical aspects of sports. People are physically getting injured, which clearly shows the physicality of esports. All of these can be severe and career-ending injuries. So notice this person is doing a good job weaving that Jolly source in. Although the injuries aren't as serious as traditional sports, such as broken, sprained, and fractured body parts, they are still harsh. So overall, this is good. We're showing the physicality of esports. A correction that I would have the student make is we want a specific comparison to a traditional sport. So they talk about broken, sprained, and fractured body parts. In my head, football and hockey are probably the most injury-prone sports. I mean, I could be wrong there, but we want to compare it to a specific sport. So they specifically talk about tennis elbow. We could talk about that. What is tennis elbow? It sounds like it comes from tennis as a common tennis injury. So we would want a comparison there to go through it. So again, notice the structure here. This person has made an opposing view claim, but given the counter right away. We would want to flip that and start with the opposing view, but now we're going to actually get into some opposing view arguments. The one thing esports lacks when compared to traditional sports definition is physical exertion. Nice, simple claim. Remember we defined sports earlier, and the physical exertion is part of it. And this person is saying that esports, for the most part, are lacking in that physical exertion. Cardiac and physical activity is one of the main things that make a sport be considered a sport. Karen Fanning, who is a contributing writer to Scholastic News Company, defines Scholastic News as a reliable online resource available for grades 1 to 6 that brings high interest current events and nonfiction to millions for print magazines. So we get a lot of ethos here, probably too much. We could definitely, I would say, cut this down a little bit. And I love the spirit here, lots of ethos about this person, but we could probably cut it down a little bit. I do like that the source is being cited again here at the end. Some students interviewed believe that video games should not be considered a sport because of the absence of physical activity. So we're interviewing somebody. This is good pathos. We're going to be talking to specific people about their personal opinions about esports. Good pathos. Nadia Idalaski from Michigan believes that a sport involves physical activity and skill. Playing video games does not require enough movement to make it a sport. In fact, people sit for hours while playing video games. Actual sports like basketball help kids get exercise they need to stay healthy. So notice that this quote is 3 lines long, so it's not quite a block quote, but it's close. But again, 3-line quotes, you're not going to lose points for block quotes like that. We're definitely getting good evidence here connected to this claim. This person is giving their opinion, not enough physical activity, and I think they're right. People sit for hours. You're not going to get your daily dose of exercise by playing video games. Great. So that's good, solid opposing view. Now we have a counter again, a second counter, which I think is great. And that's the structure that we would prefer for the opposing view section. So you have the opposing view, then we get the counter. So the new counter is, while this is true, video games still present other qualities such as quick reflexes, coordination, concentration, skill, precision, and stamina. So again, the counter is coming back again that no, you're not going to get out of breath, but there are definitely physical aspects to playing video games, and we're going to argue that is a connection to making them a real sport. Ashley Fair, an expert writer at Fansided, a fan-focused sports lifestyle entertainment network. So again, notice that this person has put the ethos in quotes. You do not need to do that. Having said that, we do get some good ethos here. Ashley Fair believes that this is similar to race car driving. There is not a lot of physical activity that occurs while driving a race car, but it's still considered a sport. And notice we're weaving fair in here, which is exactly what we want. This is good stuff. A sport does not need to be cardiovascular to be considered a sport because there are other aspects to athletic activity of the sport. So this is a counterclaim for the thesis. Again, it's similar to the claim made before. The idea that this author is acknowledging that as far as cardiovascular, getting out of breath is concerned, not happening, but there are definitely physical aspects to playing a video game that they're comparing to race car driving. Race car driving requires around the same amount of skill as video games. Therefore, video games should be able to fit in this category as well as a sport. So I think this is a true fact and a good point. We do need citation, though. Who is saying that they require similar skills? We need to talk to a race car driver or someone who knows about race car driving so we can compare the two. Because obviously a big difference, right, is the race car driver is actually physically doing something. The car is moving around them. If you're playing a racing video game, you're not actually doing anything physically in the same way. But we could use a little comparison there. Also, not all games are played by just sitting in the chair. So this is another counter, which I think is good. And again, it's a counter to what this Pathos person said before here. What Nadia said, that people often sit for hours while playing video games. We're about to get an example of a video game where you don't sit, and it's going to have a good counter for the thesis. Games like eSports require body movement in order for the sensor to comprehend a movement as a toss of a frisbee or a swing of a golf club. Another student from Scholastic News was interviewed named Noah Johnson from New York. He says, some people say playing video games does not include physical activity, but that's not always true. When I play Wii Sports, I'm constantly moving around. Sometimes I even get out of breath. Esports should be considered a sport, even though it might not fulfill the qualities of a traditional sport. So I think we get some excellent new pathos here. I think this is working. He even counters that he sometimes even gets out of breath, which is, I think, a rare quality in video games, but I think Wii Sports is a good example. We get a little commentary. I would want a little bit more commentary here, discussing maybe what Wii Sports is or some more details. But overall, structure is good. So to repeat here, just as a reminder, when you go for your opposing view, we want a 3/4 of a page to a page of opposing view. And if you're going to have a counter, which I think can be a smart argument tactic, save the counter for the end as opposed to starting with the counter the way that this one did. Okay, let's go back and review the ethos, logos, pathos, and the quote sandwich pieces, and then you guys are done. So ethos, credibility, resume, qualifications, expert. Again, remember, you need at least one argument of ethos in your paper, and that we want ethos about each author we meet as we meet them in your paper. And again, a half a sentence there is fine. Please do remember that citing or saying that the author is or the writer is the author of the article that you're quoting is not enough. We need a half a sentence more. Where did they go to school? What are their job qualifications? Whatever it is. Again, a half a sentence is fine. Again, head to Google to find stuff either about the sources or the authors. If you're having trouble, reach out. I will help you. And again, sometimes it turns out that there isn't any. Sometimes authors don't exist, or there just isn't information about a rare website, whatever the case is. But again, please reach out. Logos, we need at least one example of logos. We have logic, statistics, graphs, charts, and data. And finally, there's pathos, which is emotion and stories. So again, think about the essay that we just read. The opposing view, we had pathos from two people. We had their personal opinion. So we had Nadia's personal opinion that it's not a sport because it's not, you don't get out of breath without basketball. And then we have a counter from Noah Johnson saying that no, it is a sport. I play Wii Sports, and I sometimes even get out of breath. And Wii Sports for sure is a physical activity, swinging around the little Wii remote. Okay, let's review the quote sandwich pieces. Again, argumentative claim. For this particular paper, there's two choices. You have your thesis or your opposing view, whatever they are. For the paper that we just read, it's esports is considered a sport, or no, esports should not be considered a sport. And every argument should come back to one of those two sides. Again, part 2, introduce the author with ethos. Each time we meet a new author, we want a half a sentence of ethos about who they are. Again, if there is no author, there's always a title, so make sure you include that title. But if there is no author, you can give us ethos about the source, which is something that happened in the esports opposing view that we just read. Then we have some evidence, choices of paraphrase or quoting. Paraphrase is where you put it on your own words. Quote is a direct quote. Remember, you are allowed one block quote. Block quote is 4 lines, or more. If you have more than that, you'll lose points. You're not required to have a block quote. It is optional, but if you have one, only allowed to have one. And again, if we have a giant block quote that's like 15 or 20 lines, you're going to lose more points for that particular piece. Again, for evidence, we have the choices of ethos, logos, and pathos. And remember, you need at least one type of each argument in your paper. Commentary, discuss the claim and evidence in your own words. Again, at least a sentence, no more than 5 here probably. It's also an opportunity to transition into your next argument, or potentially to stack more evidence for the same claim if you have more stuff going through. Finally, is citation. If you've introduced the author in the sentence, you don't need to cite again at the end of that sentence, but every sentence after that, we do need clear citation. Every sentence needs a clear genesis. Where are these ideas coming from? If you have a paragraph that's from a single author, you need to be weaving that author throughout, whoever they are, each sentence. Don't assume that it's obvious. I would say the only exception for this potentially is that if you have a pathos story, let's say in this case, they talked about Noah Johnson here at the end. If this was a much longer paragraph and they talked more about Noah Johnson and his experience or whatever's going on, if you cite the pathos at the beginning, generally it's clear that that single pathos, as long as you're talking about the same person, is from that single source. With that exception, again, to repeat, everything does need to be cited, please. Everything needs to be a genesis coming from somewhere. Okay, that is the opposing view lesson. Again, check out the other lessons. Thanks so much. And again, apologies for canceling class.